Hey everybody, welcome back this week as we continue our study in the epistle to the Colossians. Uh, I'm just going to tell you, I've been so encouraged by this little book. It has been so uplifting for me and great as I've studied and prepared messages in this book. It has been really neat. It's just so full. You know, we've talked about before how in all of his letters, Paul first addresses doctrine before he gets to practice, because good doctrine affects how we live. We're going to live better when our doctrine is good. And so just through the first even chapter of this book, it is just so full of great theology and things like that, just jam-packed. And so it has been good for me. So we're going to be in Colossians chapter 1. So if you have your Bibles, you can open to there. I want to tell you, as you find that spot, just about a little game that I like to play. I really don't have a name for it, and it's not really a competition. Sometimes other people play it with me. I invite other people to play it with me, but a lot of times I just play it myself. And here's the game. If you know anything about me, you know I love to sing. That does not mean I'm a great singer, but I love to sing. I'm always just singing a song or humming a song, and there's always just songs going on in my head. And one game that I love to play is that as I am a part of conversations or I hear people talking or things like that, I love to, from a word or from a phrase that they say, just come up with a song that kind of goes along with what they say. If you've been around me long, you've heard much. You've heard me do this, but I love just to think of a song because of something they said, and I'm always singing. Well, as we get to this part of the first chapter, really verses 15 down through verse 20, in this letter to the Colossians, that's kind of what Paul has done. Remember, this is a letter about the preeminence of Christ, and Paul is writing the church at Colossae to talk about how Christ is preeminent over everything. And so we saw that even in his greeting to the church at the beginning, and then the last 2 weeks we talked about a prayer that Paul prayed. He began with a thanksgiving for how the church was living and how the gospel was affecting them. And then he had a prayer, an intercessory prayer of how he was praying that the gospel would continue to affect how they lived and how they went about their lives. And it almost seems in verse 15 what happens is Paul is writing this letter and he's telling them how he's giving thanks to them, and he's telling them how he's praying for them. And in doing that, it sends them into a song. A lot of scholars debate how verse 15 through 20, it seems to be this hymn that Paul sings, and it may be a hymn that the church sang, that he gathered for this point. It may be something he wrote. There's a lot of argument over that we're not going to spend the time to argue, but it does seem to me like Paul just, in the middle of this letter, just kind of breaks out into song. Whether it's original with him or not, it doesn't really matter too much. What matters is that he has been inspired to put it right here in this letter. And so let's read today verses 15 through 20. Now, we're not going to look at this whole song, because if we do, man, we would be here forever. But we're just going to break it down just into 3 verses. But I want to read for you the whole song, verses 15 through 20, and then we'll come down and start breaking this up. Here's what he says, starting in verse 15. He, that is Jesus, he is the image of the invisible God, the firstborn of all creation. For by him all things were created, in heaven and on earth, visible and invisible, whether thrones or dominions or rulers or authorities. All things were created through him and for him. And he is before all things, and in him all things hold together. And he is the head of the body of the church. He is the beginning, the firstborn from the dead, that in everything he might be preeminent. For in him all the fullness of God was pleased to dwell, and through him to reconcile to himself all things, whether on earth or in heaven, making peace by the blood of his cross. And so remember, this is a letter about the preeminence of Christ. And so what we're looking at in this first part of this song today what we're going to be looking at is how Christ is preeminent in creation. over everything. Next week we're going to look at, in the second part of this song, really probably the second verse of this song, of how Christ is preeminent in the church. And in both parts we see how he talks about being firstborn, and we're going to go into that in just a minute, and how he talks about being the head. But we're going to go into the firstborn part of that in just a minute. But the first verse really deals with how Christ is preeminent in creation, how he is above all of creation. And for us, what that means for us is we need to recognize his preeminence. We need to recognize how Christ is over all, and that should drive our faith. It should drive us to greater faith, to deeper faith, to more trust, to more belief in him, because he is preeminent. So the question that comes to us is, how is his preeminence in creation explained to us in this song? I think there's really about four things here. First of all, what we see in verse 15 is he is the image of the invisible God. He is the image of God. Now that means several things for us. You know, we talked about how God created us in his image, and he has. Now it's different from Christ, from Paul talking about Christ being in the image of the invisible God and us being in the image of God. For us and for Christ it was really kind of twofold. For us it's kind of one. For us it's kind of, we are the representation of God. Jesus was the representation of God here on this earth. And us being created in the image of God, we are kind of the representation of God here upon this earth. But for Christ it was different, because he was more than just the representation of God. What Jesus was, what Christ was, what makes him preeminent is he is the manifestation of God. What Christ has done for us is he has made the invisible visible. He is the image of the invisible God. He has put into human terms and human understanding. What he has put God into human understanding. He has brought, that's wrong. He hasn't put us in understanding, because we still can't understand God. But what he has done is he has put God in the human sphere. He has put it in so we can maybe just grasp a little bit of. We can hold a little bit to God. He is the image of the invisible God. A few years ago, we were going through some of the catechism with our kids, and one thing that the catechism teaches is that God is spirit, and in that he is invisible. We don't see him. God is spirit. But what Jesus does is he manifests God. He makes the invisible visible. He brings God into the human sphere. He is Emmanuel, God with us. And so Jesus is the image of the invisible God. And him being the manifestation of God, that gives him all the character and all the traits of God and who God is. He is God on earth. He is Emmanuel, God with us. And him being God, well, yeah, that makes him preeminent. He is above everything. The second thing we see here is that he is the firstborn of creation. Verse 15 again, he is the image of the invisible God. He is the firstborn of all creation. Here's what that means. In Western civilization, when we hear firstborn, we think born first. That Jesus was born first. And that was one of the heresies probably that was going on in the church of Colossae, with it, that they were trying to make Jesus not equal with God. They were not making him be the manifestation of God upon the earth. They didn't want Jesus to be God. They were trying to explain that away. And so for Paul to say that he is the firstborn, you would think that would argue into that argument that Jesus was created. He was the firstborn of the creation. He was created first. But that's really not what firstborn means in this mindset. Firstborn doesn't have so much to do with the order that you were born in, but it really has more to do to position. It doesn't have to do with birth order. It has to do with position. When Paul says Christ is the firstborn of all creation, what he is telling us is that he is above all creation. Now think about it. In other passages, think about John, the famous verse that we all know, John 3:16. For God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son, his one and only Son. God gave his one and only Son. Well, how can the only begotten be the firstborn? He is the only born. So when he calls Jesus the firstborn of all creation, he's not talking about birth order. He's not talking about created order, because Jesus, Christ, is God. He is talking about rank over creation. That Jesus is above all creation. He is the firstborn of all created. Third, I think what we see, so we see that he is the image of the invisible God. We see that he is the firstborn of all creation. And third, what we see in verse 16 is that he is the creator. If firstborn has to do with birth order, how can he go to the next verse and call him the creator? Listen to what he says in verse 16. For by him all things were created in heaven and on earth, visible and invisible, whether thrones or dominions or rulers or authorities. All things were created through him and for him. What he says is all things on the earth, what we can see, mankind, the earth, the light, the moon, the sun, the stars, the creatures, all of those things, all on the earth, all of the visible, all that we can see, Jesus created. He is the creator. Not only that, he is the creator of the invisible. He is the creator of the invisible. He is the creator of the heavens and the invisible. Here's what that means. Listen, and don't pass this up lightly. Okay? Don't pass this up lightly. We want to give so much power and credence to Satan. And to Satan, and does he have dominion on this earth? Yes, he does. But he is not all-powerful. He is not firstborn of creation. Christ is. Understand, Satan was a created being. And who is he created by? Well, the easy answer is God. But who is he created by? Christ. Christ. Satan can be all places at all times, and he can't have all power, and he can't have all things, because he is created. He is a created being. It goes on to say that he created, that Jesus created the thrones or dominions or rulers or authorities and all those things that we see. And honestly, in our world right now, we see, it seems like Satan unleashed and his dominions unleashed, because we see people being murdered, and we see such anger and hatred and violence, and we see such chaos in our world today. But understand, all of those dominions, they're not the firstborn of creation. Christ is preeminent over all those things. He has power over all of those things because he is preeminent. He is preeminent. He is the image of the invisible God. He is the firstborn over all creation. And finally, he is before all things. Verse 17 says it. And he is before all things, and in him all things hold together. He is before all things. Why? Because he is God. He is preeminent. He is the firstborn of over all creation. He is the creator. He is before all things and in all things. How does that verse end? In him all things hold together. He sustains all. Listen, church, I know you've seen, you don't live in a bubble, and I know you've seen we're coming out of this pandemic, it almost feels like, but still, even in the pandemic, if you look at numbers, people are getting this every day and people are dying every day. And while you hear arguments that it may not be as bad as they thought it was going to be, and this is overblown and all that, I'm not getting into any of those arguments, but we seem to be coming out of that. But as we come out in a time where you would hope for unity and you would hope for this, we see chaos and violence. We see the guy who was George Floyd, and we saw that happen, and the other instances of needless brutality. And then in the rioting and things, we see so much hatred and chaos and evil. And it just seems like a time, like I've seen so many people who are just down and you don't know what to say and you don't know what to do. And I'm with you. I understand that. But in the midst of that, what we need to find is Christ. He is preeminent. He is God with us, Emmanuel. He is the image of the invisible God. He is the firstborn of all creation. He is the creator. He is before all things. And as we see chaos seem to thrive and we see violence seem to thrive on our earth, on this earth, what we need to do is run to Christ. We need to trust Him. We need to fall in His grace. We need to fall into His love. And as we do that, as our faith, as we see Christ is preeminent in all these things, and it drives our faith deeper, what that should then do in our lives is help us to love. Not just people that are like us, but people that are different from us. It should help us to love, and it should help us to see all people as the representations of all people are created in the image of God. We are different from Jesus, and we can't compare ourselves in the same way, but we're all created in His image. So that should help us and drive us as our faith is driven to this preeminent Christ. It should help us to love people the way that Christ does. To care for people the way that Christ does. To stand for right the way that Christ did. To be willing to sacrifice the way that Christ did. To serve the way that Christ did. Not just those who are like us, or not just those that we love, but even those that don't like us and who are different from us. Help us to love. Let me pray for you. God, You're good. Christ, You are preeminent. You are above all. You are before all things, and in You all things hold together. So God, in our world, we are praying that we trust You more, that we place that our faith in You grows deeper because You are preeminent. Help us to grow more like You so that we can love like You, care like You, serve like You, become more like You. We love You. In Jesus' name, amen. Have a good week.